Well, good morning. I'm Joe Leimkuhler, Vice President of Drilling for Log Exploration, based right here in South Louisiana, just across the lake in Covington. So I've been asked to give you a presentation on oil, and we're going to focus on the differences between onshore and offshore. But first, the disclaimer, I am an engineer, and I like a lot of data, graphs, and information. And I was told in college and presentations workshop to keep it simple, one slide every 5 minutes. Forget that. I'm going to give you 30 slides in 15 minutes, so let's go. So first thing I'm going to give you, I'm going to start with the slide I showed in Houston, an oil overview, the role of oil in the U.S. energy mix. We'll talk about sources, both onshore, offshore, imports, and exports. I'm going to dispel your common perception that maybe you think oil is oil, right? Well, that's wrong. And then we'll do a look forward, and we'll contrast onshore versus offshore oil and the keys to the future. So quickly, an oil overview. This is a slide that I showed at the breakfast keynote in Houston. And I'm not going to go over in detail, but you can see the total energy that we consume in the country. I've updated the slide to reflect information from 2017. And the thing that caught my eye is that we still import 53% of the oil that we use in this country is still imported. And I think that takes a lot of people by surprise. So keep that in mind as we go forward. This is what it looked like in 2010. I was still working for Shell at the time, and I remember the big hot item of the day was called peak oil. A Shell geologist named Hubert came up with the concept that for conventional oil production, it had peaked. And we are on the downslide, and it doesn't look good. And it really came to bear when Katrina and Ike hit, two storms that took out all of the offshore oil production in the country for about 2 or 3 weeks. And it got so bad, according to John Hofmeister, former president of Shell, the East Coast was 1 day away from running out because the Colonial Oil pipeline from the refineries on the Gulf Coast was down. That's how close we were. It looked dire. And at the time, oil was spiking to $140 a barrel, and then this happened. It took me by surprise. Fracking. The fracking impact. Horizontal fracks in tight oil reservoirs totally reversed it at an unprecedented rate. And then prices, the price floor dropped out. Oil went from 100, it all the way got down to $25 a barrel at one point. And we saw that production drop. And we saw it drop at the same rate it went up because fracking oil is tied to rig activity. The flush oil that initially comes out of these wells, does that mean that shale is just a flash in the pan? That's what I thought. But the frackers, through innovation, improved fracking technology, better understanding of the geology, where to place your well, how to frack it, they actually turned the tide. And with oil prices going into the 40s, you saw it start to move, and you saw rig counts go up. And rig counts haven't returned to where they were before, but yet oil production last month peaked. All-time high in this country ever of $11 million a barrel, with oil prices not at 100, oil prices at 60. That's just astounding to me. So really, that's where we are right now. Now, if everyone thinks, oh my gosh, we're on the road to energy independence, everything is going to be great, and maybe it will be. But we have some trends that are a little concerning. So this is a breakdown of oil production. It's the same chart I just showed you, but the EIA started to break down oil production back in the 80s, and now you can see where it's actually coming from. Look at the lower 48 onshore production. If it wasn't for shale oil, we would be experiencing peak oil. Offshore oil is also at a maximum. Both are in record production levels in 2018, but conventional onshore oil is extremely down, as is production from Alaska. And if it wasn't for the technology play of horizontal drilling and the offshore advancements we've made in technology, peak oil would be a reality for this country, and things would be drastically different. So taking a quick look at Alaska, what most people don't realize is that Alaska peaked in the 1980s. And in 1980, the share of American production on a barrels per day basis is the same as U.S. offshore is right now. But look at what's happened to Alaska with no access to additional resources that are up there. The pipeline is in serious decline. And people think it'll be a long tail. It won't. That oil cools tremendously flowing through that pipeline. It cools so much that it acquires a viscosity such that once you reach about 350,000 barrels a day, it shuts down. And that's projected to occur in the next 8 to 10 years if we can't supply new sources of oil to the Trans-Alaska pipeline. So Alaska, at just 4% of U.S. oil production, will continue to play a minor role until new fields are discovered on the North Slope. So that brings us to the U.S. oil shale production by region. There are 7 major regions. There's the Marcellus Shale in the eastern U.S. It's predominantly gas. Very little oil comes out of it, and I'll show that to you in a minute. There's the Bakken up in North Dakota. There's the Niobrara in the Colorado-Wyoming area, which has got an interesting proposal in Colorado with the legislature proposing a setback that will really restrict a tremendous amount of that drilling. And then you've got the 4 big plays in the south central U.S., centered in Texas and Oklahoma, particularly the Permian. So this is an amazing graph in my view. From 2011 to 2018, we've had incredible growth in shale oil production. That growth has averaged 20% per year for 7 years. For those who are economists, that is an amazing return. We've gone from 1.6 million barrels a day to 7.5 million barrels per day, an increase of 470%, and it's predominantly coming from Texas. So oil's oil, right? Man, that's awesome. Well, it's interesting when you take a real quick look. So this is just oil production from 2015 to 2018 by oil type. And API uses a thing called degrees API. All you need to know is to measure how heavy the oil is. If oil has an API of 10, it's the same density of water. An API of 10 or less will actually sink. And the API for heavy crude, that's actually down 30%. That has been the historical production that has fueled the U.S., okay? Here is an API. I actually have visual aids because I live here and I can transport this stuff in my car, not a plane. This is conventional API crude at 21 degrees API. This came from a well we unloaded in the Gulf just last year. This is 42 degree API oil. Production is actually down for intermediate crudes, which has been the lifeblood of the country. Natural gas production is actually down because gas prices are very low. And most interesting, very light crudes, this. The Beverly Hillbillies called it Texas tea. You know, it's kind of close to tea. It's very, very light. And that is the predominant production that's coming out. Frac oil is closer to actually condensate than conventional crude oil. And I don't think most people realize that. The basics of refining is crude oil is a mixture of components from methane, ethane, propane, butane, all the way up to the monster 40 carbon molecules long tetraoctane that all gets put into the refinery. It gets heated up and cracked. And then it goes into a distillation column. And out of the top come your condensates, your butane lighters, propane that heats your homes, straight run gasoline. But out of the lower API crudes comes your kerosene, your jet fuel, your diesel, your fuel oil, the things that really power a lot of American industries. Guess what? The yield from frac oil and that stuff is extremely low. So it's fascinating. U.S. production is surging, dominated by frac oil, as you see there in green. But from a utilization basis, it's more like condensate versus conventional crude. It has qualities that make it ill-suited for many conventional uses. Frac oil has a lot of paraffin in it. It's hard to refine that out. Therefore, it's very ill-suited for jet fuel. We may become energy or BTU independent, but we're very unlikely to become oil independent. Imports and domestic production of higher quality, more versatile crude is required and even needed, but it comes at a premium price, literally. I took this picture of the gas station at the end of the causeway here in New Orleans last week, and I was shocked to see the price spread from low-octane gasoline, which you get from frac oil, versus the higher octanes that require more conventional crudes. It's up to 55 cents a gallon, and diesel is in the same range. So that's an interesting thing. But what's good for what decreases onshore actually helps offshore. This is the price spread from South Louisiana sweet crude to West Texas intermediate. I was shocked to see that the price is maintained. And this caught my eye because even though it averaged $4 over the last year, 2 months ago, back in June, when Libya went offline due to the unrest in Libya, jet fuel prices surged. And the price spread between West Texas Intermediate and South Louisiana crude got to $10 a barrel. So what I think we're seeing right now is a systemic issue around crude quality. And you need a mixture of crudes produced. And you'll see a price premium for offshore oil going forward. And I've encouraged our economists at LOG to take that into account when we approve our projects. You can see what happened when Libya declared force majeure, what the price spreads got between the West Texas Intermediate and the South Louisiana Sweet. So there's a price premium that makes offshore very much more attractive. So looking forward, what does that look like? Here's U.S. offshore U.S. production. What you see in blue is the U.S. Gulf of Mexico, both the shelf and the deep water. What you see in purple is the offshore California and offshore Alaska, where there's no new drilling allowed, no new drilling pads. You can still drill out there, but it must be from existing structures. So you can see that production is in serious decline. The future for the Gulf of offshore production in the U.S. is absolutely the deepwater Gulf of Mexico. So an overview. Record production in 2018, it's driven by technology. The rigs that we deploy offshore are simply amazing. They use dual drilling centers with fully robotic capabilities. The productivity we can get from one rig has driven the drilling costs for some of these deep wells we drill offshore from 130 days down to 50 days. So we basically cut the price in half. They're computer driven, the technology and the skills of the people who run the rigs is phenomenal, and we can do subsea developments at a fraction of the costs that we used to. Our cost structure is changing dramatically even as we speak. So quick basics on the Gulf of Mexico, it was just like an inland sea. It was like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea until it was opened through continental drift and exposure to the ocean. So you see in maroon layers of salt, and that salt actually covers tremendous amounts of the resource in the Gulf of Mexico. And the current deepwater play right now is below the salt. But historically, on a seismic basis, you couldn't see. You literally couldn't see below the salt because all the energy would be reflected off the top of the salt. Well, through computer processing and improved seismic technology, we can now see below the salt. So all the hot plays right now in the Gulf of Mexico are below salt, and you're seeing a renaissance occurring in the offshore. The Norphlet, the subsalt Pliocene and the Miocene, those places where you can see the stars, that's where the hot activity is offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. You're in New Orleans right now. How does that play in terms of seismic? Here's an older image from prior salt processing of this data set. You can see the salt. You can see all the reflective energy is just gone below the salt. It looks like a TV screen from the 1960s when your station went off the air in black and white. This is what you can do through improved computer processing and improved seismic. You can now see underneath the salt. So go back to the prior slide. All that resource, which you know is there, you just can't see it well enough to invest the money to drill a well and try and go get it. Now you have the information to go get it. So with 60% of the Gulf of Mexico covered in salt and virtually unexplored, we honestly can't say what we know is there, because only until now can we actually see it. So looking forward, this is our permitting process for the Gulf of Mexico. In best case, working with the federal and the state agencies, EPA, Department of Interior, across the gamut of federal regulators we have to deal with. It takes me 3 years from the time I buy a lease to when I can actually start production from that lease, and that is the absolute optimum. Typically, it's 5 to 7 years. Contrasting onshore to offshore production, well productivity onshore is low. Offshore, it's extremely high, 3,000 to 30,000 barrels a day per well. Onshore, we're dealing in low permeability reservoirs. Offshore, it's high permeability reservoirs. I don't have time to go through each one of these in detail, but you can see they complement one another. And where this is leading to is the big bottom line. Can I get a price in dollars per barrel higher than what it takes to find, develop, and produce that same barrel of oil? These are the break-even prices for onshore oil and offshore oil. The press likes to think that, my goodness, offshore is going to struggle to compete. What they don't realize is that the cost structure has fundamentally changed just within the last 12 months. And this is what you're looking at now for the offshore cost structure. You're going to see a renaissance occur in offshore oil, is my prediction. The bottom line is that on a go-forward basis, we're going to get a higher value for our product, and our find and development costs once the legacy high-dollar contracts that are currently in place for a lot of operators expire. And they've expired for long, and we're increasing our activity. So the total project cost to develop onshore is tens to hundreds of millions. For an offshore field, we're dealing in the billions. So the added time value of money is also a huge exposure for offshore. The jobs economic impact is immense. The last project LLOG put in Delta House employed 15 countries of activity, 10,000 workers, and 171 companies. So if we truly were to focus on that energy independence, the benefits would be absolutely incredible. The bottom line is the U.S. needs both a robust onshore and offshore oil and gas industry to supply the nation with critical supplies of low-cost and reliable energy. They have contrasting strengths and weaknesses. So here's the keys to the future. I'm going to get to it real quick. You can see what's done on our imports to exports. It's a complicated slide, but right now the current trend of exports shows us being a net exporter of oil in 2 to 3 years, but we are still going to have to import a tremendous amount of oil. Those are the key takeaways. In closing, the future, for a variety of reasons, we need a stronger onshore and offshore for energy diversity and a strong oil economy. The strengths and weaknesses counteract. The technology and the geological advances are amazing. But without that, peak oil would absolutely be a reality. And oil independence as measured by oil imports is not possible. Therefore, free trade is absolutely essential, and a fair regulatory environment where good regulations do not equal more prescriptive regulations. They equal safer and regulations where the government and industries cooperate together. Thank you very much.